The dust still settled over the charred remains of Copper Creek when the stagecoach rolled into what had once been a thriving frontier settlement. Seraphina Whitmore pressed her face to the window, her heart sinking as she took in the devastation that stretched before her. Burned buildings stood like broken teeth against the horizon, their skeletal frames reaching toward a sky that seemed too blue for such tragedy. The woman who had traveled nearly 2,000 miles to marry a man she'd never met clutched her worn leather satchel closer, the weight of her few remaining possessions suddenly feeling heavier than the uncertainty that had driven her west. The driver's weathered face appeared at the window, his expression grim as he surveyed the destruction. "Miss, I'm afraid there's been some trouble here. Might be best if you came back with me to Fort Collins." His voice carried the careful tone of a man who'd seen too much violence, who knew the signs of an Apache raid when he saw them. Seraphina straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of strength she'd cultivated during 3 years of caring for her dying mother while their Boston creditors circled like vultures. "I've come this far, sir. I'll not turn back now." Her voice held the refined accent of Eastern education, but beneath it lay steel forged in hardship. The advertisement in the matrimonial paper had promised a new life with Thomas Brennan, a prosperous rancher seeking a wife to help build his empire in the Colorado Territory. Now, looking at the ash-covered ground where his ranch house should have stood, she wondered if that promise had died with him. The stagecoach lurched to a halt near what had once been the town's main street. Seraphina gathered her dark blue traveling dress and stepped down, her button-up boots sinking slightly into the dust. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the wind whistling through the remains of buildings and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Her trunk hit the ground with a hollow thud, containing everything she owned in the world. 3 dresses, her mother's jewelry, a daguerreotype of her parents, and the letters from Thomas that had convinced her to leave everything behind. "Ma'am, you can't stay here alone," the driver insisted, his eyes scanning the surrounding hills with practiced wariness. "Apache been active in these parts. They hit this place 3 days ago, killed near everyone. No survivors that we know of." Seraphina's gloved hands trembled as she absorbed this news, but she kept her chin raised. At 24, she had learned that survival often meant accepting truths that shattered your dreams and finding the courage to build new ones from the pieces. The marriage arrangement with Thomas had been her last hope of escaping the poverty that had consumed her family after her father's failed business ventures. Now, standing in the ruins of what should have been her new home, she faced a choice: return to Boston and a life of certain destitution, or find a way to survive in this harsh wilderness. "I have nowhere else to go," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "Please, just leave my trunk. I'll figure something out." The driver shook his head, muttering under his breath about fool women and their stubborn pride, but he climbed back onto his seat. The crack of his whip echoed across the empty settlement as the stagecoach rolled away, leaving Seraphina alone with the ghosts of Copper Creek and the growing shadows of late afternoon. She walked slowly through the devastation, her skirts rustling against the debris. The general store was nothing but blackened timbers and melted glass. The church, where she had imagined marrying Thomas, stood roofless, its bell hanging crooked in a tower that swayed ominously in the wind. Each step took her deeper into the reality of her situation. She was a single woman, alone in hostile territory, with no money for return passage and no prospects for survival. It was near the ruins of what might have been Thomas's ranch house that she found the first body, a man, face down in the dirt, his clothes burned and bloodied. She turned away, pressing her handkerchief to her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. This could be Thomas, the man whose letters had spoken of building a future together, of children playing in fields of corn and cattle grazing in green pastures. Now his dream, like his body, lay broken in the dust. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded her uncomfortably of flames. Serafina knew she couldn't survive a night in the open, not with hostile tribes in the area and wild animals drawn to the scent of death. She made her way to the least damaged building, a small cabin on the edge of town that might have belonged to a blacksmith, judging by the bent horseshoes scattered around the doorway. Inside, she found overturned furniture and broken pottery, but the roof was mostly intact. She gathered what wood she could find and managed to start a small fire in the stone hearth, grateful for the practical skills her mother had insisted she learn despite their genteel pretensions. As darkness fell around her, she sat on her trunk and tried to plan her next move, though the options seemed impossibly limited. That's when she heard the horse. Serafina froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the small derringer her father had given her years ago, hidden in the folds of her dress. The sound of hoofbeats approached slowly, deliberately, as if the rider was being cautious. Through a crack in the boarded window, she could see a figure on horseback silhouetted against the starlit sky. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized that whoever had destroyed Copper Creek might have returned to finish what they started. The horse stopped just outside the cabin. She heard the soft thud of boots hitting the ground, then footsteps approaching the door. The old hinges creaked, and moonlight spilled across the threshold as the door swung open. Serafina raised her derringer with shaking hands, knowing it would likely do little good against a warrior's bow or rifle, but determined to sell her life dearly. The figure that stepped into the firelight was not what she expected. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness. His hair was long and dark, braided with leather and beads, and his clothing was a mixture of traditional buckskin and white man's fabric. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, dark and intelligent, holding no malice despite the tomahawk at his belt and the rifle in his hands. "You should not be here," he said, his English clear, but accented with the cadence of his native tongue. "This place is marked by death. The spirits of the murdered walk these grounds." Serafina kept her derringer trained on him, though her hands were steadying as curiosity began to replace immediate terror. Did you? She couldn't finish the question, couldn't ask if he was responsible for the massacre that had destroyed her future. He seemed to understand anyway. "I am not your enemy, white woman. My name is Ayana, which means eternal blossom in my grandmother's tongue. I come from the Cheyenne people, and we had no part in what happened here." He lowered his rifle, a gesture that could have been seen as either peaceful or confident in his ability to handle one frightened woman. Without it, then who? Serafina's voice was barely a whisper. "A Kiowa war party, led by a chief called Burning Sky. They seek revenge for soldiers who attacked their village last month, killed women and children." His expression darkened. "They do not distinguish between innocent settlers and those who wronged them. To them, all white faces are the same." The reality of her situation hit her like a physical blow. She was trapped in the middle of a war she didn't understand, surrounded by dangers she couldn't even identify. The derringer felt pathetically small in her hands as she realized how utterly unprepared she was for this harsh frontier life. "Why are you here?" she asked, studying his face in the flickering firelight. There was something about him that didn't fit with her limited understanding of Indian warriors, an education in his speech, a thoughtfulness in his manner that suggested a complex history. Ayana was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the flames. "I was tracking the war party when I saw your fire. Burning Sky and his warriors are still in the area, and a white woman alone—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear enough. "I have nowhere else to go," Serafina said, finally lowering her weapon. I came here to marry a man named Thomas Brennan, but he's—" She gestured helplessly at the devastation around them. Dead, along with all the others. Ayanna moved closer to the fire, and she could see the details of his face more clearly. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps near her own age, with features that spoke of mixed heritage, the high cheekbones and bronze skin of his mother's people, but something else as well, something that suggested a white father. Somewhere in his lineage, "You are far from your home," he observed, settling cross-legged on the floor with an easy grace that spoke of countless nights spent around campfires. "What drove you to seek marriage with a stranger in this dangerous land?" The question touched on wounds still raw, but something about his manner encouraged honesty. "Poverty," she said simply. "My father lost everything in bad investments, and when he died, the creditors took what little remained. My mother was ill for 3 years before she passed, and I spent everything we had on medicine and doctors. Thomas's letters promised a partnership, a chance to build something together." Ayanna nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his eyes. "And now you find yourself alone in a land that shows no mercy to the unprepared. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you." The sound of distant war cries echoed across the empty settlement, and Seraphina's blood turned to ice as she realized that Burning Sky's warriors were returning to Copper Creek. The war cries pierced the night like knives through silk, growing closer with each heartbeat. Seraphina's derringer felt like a child's toy in her trembling hands as the sound of hoofbeats thundered toward the cabin. Ayanna moved with liquid speed, dousing the fire with dirt and plunging them into darkness. "Stay silent," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper against her ear. "They hunt by firelight and sound." Through the gaps in the boarded windows, orange flames flickered in the distance. The warriors were setting fire to the remaining structures, their voices rising in triumph as they destroyed what little the previous raid had left standing. Seraphina pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give them away. The smell of smoke drifted through the cracks in the cabin walls, acrid and choking. Ayanna's hand found her shoulder in the darkness, steadying her as another wave of war cries echoed across the settlement. She could hear individual voices now, calling to each other in a language that sounded like music, twisted into something fierce and primal. "How many?" she whispered, the words barely forming on her lips. 12, maybe 15. His breath was warm against her ear. "Burning Sky brings his best warriors. They celebrate their victory over the soldiers who wronged them." The hoofbeats were circling now, the warriors moving through the ruins with methodical precision. A torch appeared at their window, its light probing the darkness inside the cabin. Seraphina held her breath until her lungs burned, pressing deeper into the shadows as painted faces peered through the gaps in the boards. One warrior dismounted near their door. Through the cracks, she could see him clearly, tall and lean, with scars across his chest that caught the torchlight like silver threads. Feathers hung from his long black hair, and his face was painted in red and black stripes that made him look like something from her worst nightmares. The door handle rattled. Seraphina's grip tightened on her derringer, though she knew it would be useless against so many. Beside her, Ayanna had drawn a long knife from his belt, the blade gleaming faintly in the torchlight, filtering through the window. His body was coiled like a spring, ready to fight, though they both knew it would mean their deaths. The warrior outside spoke to his companions, his voice carrying the authority of command. This had to be Burning Sky himself, the chief who had led the massacre. Seraphina understood none of the words, but the tone made her skin crawl. He was deciding whether the cabin was worth investigating, whether potential survivors might be hiding inside. Minutes stretched like hours. The painted warrior walked around the cabin's perimeter, testing boards, looking for signs of recent habitation. Serafina realized with growing horror that her trunk still sat outside where the stagecoach had left it. Her traveling dress, her small collection of belongings, everything that marked her as a white woman in this place of death. Burning Sky must have found it. His voice rose in excitement, calling to his warriors. Hoofbeats converged on their position as the raiding party gathered around the evidence of her presence. The chief barked orders, and warriors began spreading out, searching every shadow, every possible hiding place. "They know someone is here," Ayana whispered, his knife ready. "When they find us, stay behind me. Run when I tell you to run. I won't leave you to die alone," she breathed back, surprising herself with the fierce conviction in her voice. Something in her tone made him turn to look at her, even in the darkness. "You barely know me. Why would you—" "Because you're the only decent thing I've found in this godforsaken place." The words came from somewhere deep inside her, from a well of loneliness she hadn't even acknowledged. "Because I'm tired of watching good people die while I run away." The cabin door exploded. Inward, Burning Sky stood framed in the doorway, torch held high, his painted face a mask of triumph and bloodlust. Behind him, 4 warriors pressed forward, weapons ready. The chief's eyes swept the interior until they found Serafina and Ayana pressed against the far wall. When Burning Sky spoke, his English was broken but clear enough to chill her blood. "White woman, you come to marry dead man, yes? Now you join him in spirit world." He gestured to his warriors, who stepped forward with eager grins. One carried a rope, another a long-bladed knife that had dried blood on its edge. They moved with the casual confidence of men who had done this many times before, who knew exactly how much pain they could inflict before their victims stopped screaming. That's when Ayana did something Serafina never expected. He stepped in front of her and spoke to Burning Sky in fluent Kiowa, his voice carrying an authority that made the advancing warriors pause. The exchange was rapid, heated. Burning Sky's expression changed from triumph to confusion to something that might have been respect. He replied in his own language, his tone questioning. Ayana answered, gesturing to Serafina, then to himself, his words flowing like water. "Over stone." "What are you telling him?" Serafina whispered, but Ayana held up a hand for silence. The conversation continued for several more minutes. The other warriors grew restless, fingering their weapons, clearly eager to finish what they'd started. But Burning Sky held them back with sharp commands, his painted face thoughtful as he studied Ayana with new interest. Finally, the chief spoke a single word in English. "Prove." Ayana nodded and began untying something from around his neck. In the torchlight, Serafina saw him pull out a leather cord, holding what looked like an animal claw wrapped in beadwork. He held it up for Burning Sky to see, speaking more words in Kiowa. The chief's eyes widened. He stepped closer, examining the ornament, then looked at Ayana with something approaching awe. The other warriors had gone completely still, their earlier bloodlust replaced by uncertainty. Burning Sky spoke again, this time in English, his words directed at Serafina. "This man says you are his woman, says you carry his child. This true?" Serafina's mind reeled. Ayana was claiming her as his wife, protecting her with a lie that could save her life or damn them both. She met his eyes across the small space, seeing the desperate hope there, the silent plea for her to play along. With this deception, "Yes," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Yes, it's true." Burning Sky studied them both for a long moment, then spoke rapidly to Ayana in Kiowa. Whatever he said made the younger man's face tighten with what looked like fear. "What did he say?" Serafina asked. Ayana's voice was carefully controlled. When he answered, "He says, if you are truly my woman, and if you truly carry my child, then you will prove it in the way of his people." Tomorrow, when the sun reaches its highest point, you will undergo the test of the sacred fire." "What kind of test?" But before Ayana could answer, Burning Sky barked another command. Two warriors stepped forward, binding their hands with rawhide ropes. The chief smiled, showing teeth filed to sharp points. "You live until tomorrow, white woman. Then we see if your words are truth or lies. If lies—" He drew his finger across his throat in a gesture that needed no translation. As they were dragged from the cabin into the cold night air, Serafina realized that Ayana's desperate gamble had bought them time, but at a terrible price. Whatever test awaited her tomorrow, it would likely mean death for them both. But looking at the painted faces surrounding them, the weapons glinting in the torchlight, she knew that a chance at life tomorrow was better than certain death tonight. The warriors bound them to posts driven into the ground near the ruins of the church, close enough to speak, but far enough apart that they couldn't reach each other. As Burning Sky's men settled down to wait for dawn, building their own fires and passing around bottles of whiskey looted from the settlement, Serafina found herself staring up at the stars and wondering if she would live to see them again. "Ayana," she whispered when the guards weren't paying attention, "this test tomorrow, what exactly does it involve?" His answer came after a long pause, heavy with regret. "Fire, pain, and probably death. I'm sorry, Serafina. I thought it might buy us time to escape, but now we're tied up and surrounded by 15 warriors," she finished quietly. "I understand. You tried to save me. I failed you. Just like I failed." He stopped abruptly, as if catching himself before revealing something painful. "Failed? Who?" she pressed, sensing there was more to his story than he'd revealed. Another long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with old grief. "My wife. My real wife. She died because I couldn't protect her from men like these." The confession hung between them, like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Serafina felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of shared loss that went deeper than their current predicament. "Tell me about her," she said softly. "Sarah." The name came out like a prayer. "She was white, like you. A teacher who came to work at the mission school. We fell in love despite everything that should have kept us apart." His voice broke slightly. "When her own people found out about us, they made sure she paid the price for loving a half-breed." Understanding flooded through Serafina like cold water. No wonder he had risked his life to protect her. No wonder he understood the desperation that had driven her to this wilderness. They were both refugees from their own kinds of war, seeking something that seemed impossible in a world determined to tear apart anyone who dared to love across the lines that divided them. "I'm sorry," she whispered, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "Don't be sorry yet," he replied, and she could hear the ghost of a smile in his voice. "Wait until tomorrow's test kills us both, then you can be sorry." Despite everything, Serafina found herself almost smiling back. Here they were, bound and helpless, facing torture and death at sunrise, and somehow this strange, broken man could still find dark humor in their situation. It reminded her of something her father used to say, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to laugh in its face. As the night deepened around them and the warriors' fires burned lower, she found herself studying Ayana's profile. In the dying light, tomorrow might bring death, but tonight she wasn't alone. For the first time since leaving Boston, she wasn't facing her fears in isolation. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, it terrified her more than anything else had so far, because now she had something to lose beyond her own life. Dawn came like a slow burn across the horizon, painting the destroyed settlement in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Serafina uncomfortably of blood and fire. Her bonds had cut off circulation to her hands, hours ago, leaving her fingers, numb and useless. Beside her, Ayana sat silent and watchful, his dark eyes tracking the movements of their captors as the warriors prepared for whatever ritual awaited them. Burning Sky emerged from his shelter as the sun climbed higher. His war paint, freshly applied in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light. He wore a headdress of eagle feathers that caught the wind, making him look like some ancient god of war, risen from the earth itself. The other warriors gathered around him, their faces painted for ceremony, their weapons gleaming. "Time for truth," the chief announced, his broken English carrying clearly across the camp. "White woman says she carries child of Cheyenne warrior. Sacred fire will tell us if her words are poison or medicine." Two warriors began building a large fire in the center of the ruined church, using timber from the destroyed buildings. The flames grew higher and higher until the heat could be felt even from where Seraphina sat bound. Her mouth went dry as she watched them place iron rods into the fire, the metal beginning to glow red-hot. "What exactly is this test?" she whispered to Ayana, though part of her already feared the answer. "In the old ways, when a woman's virtue was questioned, she would walk barefoot across burning coals while carrying a heated stone," he replied, quietly. If she spoke truth, the spirits would protect her. If she lied, he didn't need to finish. Seraphina could see the outcome written in the eager faces of the watching warriors, in the way they fingered their knives and tomahawks. This wasn't really a test. It was an elaborate form of execution designed to provide entertainment before the killing began. "There has to be another way," she said, struggling against the rawhide bonds that held her to the wooden post. "Some there is," Ayana interrupted, his voice heavy with resignation. "But it would require me to challenge Burning Sky to single combat. Winner takes all, your life, your freedom, the right to decide your fate." Seraphina's heart lurched. "And the loser?" "Dies slowly, for the entertainment of the tribe." His eyes met hers across the distance between their posts. "But at least it would be me dying instead of you." "No." The word came out fiercer than she'd intended, loud enough to draw glances from the nearest warriors. She lowered her voice, but kept the steel in it. "I won't let you die for me. We'll find another way." "There is no other way, Seraphina." For the first time since she'd met him, Ayana's composure cracked slightly. "I failed Sarah when she needed me most. I won't fail you too." Before she could respond, Burning Sky strode over to them, his scarred face split by a predatory grin. He barked commands in Kiowa, and warriors rushed to cut their bonds and haul them to their feet. Seraphina's legs nearly gave out as circulation returned in painful tingles, but rough hands kept her upright. They were dragged to the edge of the fire pit, where the heat was so intense it felt like standing next to an open furnace. The iron rods glowed white-hot now, and one of the warriors used leather-wrapped tongs to lift a flat stone from the flames. Even from several feet away, Seraphina could feel the heat radiating from the rock like a small sun. "You will carry sacred stone across fire," Burning Sky explained, gesturing to a path of burning coals that had been spread between 2 points. "If spirits protect you, stone will not burn flesh. If you lie about child, about being woman of Cheyenne, warrior," he smiled, showing those filed teeth again, "stone will cook meat from your bones." Seraphina stared at the glowing coals, at the white-hot stone that would sear through her hands the moment she touched it. Her mind raced, searching for some escape, some clever argument that might save them both. But the painted faces surrounding her showed no mercy, no interest in alternatives to their deadly game. That's when Ayana spoke up, his voice carrying the formal tone of ritual challenge. "Burning Sky, war chief of the Kiowa, I claim the right of trial by combat." The effect was immediate and electric. The watching warriors fell silent, their eyes turning to their chief. Burning Sky's grin faded, replaced by something that might have been respect mixed with annoyance. "You know the old ways, half-breed," the chief said slowly. "But are you sure you wish to die for this white woman's lies?" "I'm sure I wish to die. For the truth," Ayana replied, meeting the bigger man's stare without flinching. "And the truth is that Serafina carries my child, and I will defend her honor with my life." Serafina wanted to scream at him to stop, to tell him that dying for a lie wasn't noble but foolish. But she could see in his eyes that this was about more than just her life or their current predicament. This was about redemption, about refusing to fail another woman he cared about. Somehow, impossibly, he had come to care about her, a stranger he'd known for less than a day. Burning Sky considered the challenge for a long moment, his painted face thoughtful. Around them, the warriors muttered among themselves, some arguing in favor of accepting the combat, others preferring the spectacle of the fire trial. Finally, the chief nodded slowly. "Single combat it is, but not to the death. That would face good warriors." His smile returned, cruel and calculating. "First blood. Winner claims the woman. Loser—" He paused dramatically. "Loser watches while his woman burns." The terms were arguably worse than a fight to the death. If Ayana lost, he would be forced to watch Serafina die in agony before they killed him too. But if he won, they would both be free, assuming Burning Sky honored the outcome, which seemed far from certain. "I accept," Ayana said, without hesitation. The warriors quickly formed a circle, creating an arena in the dirt near the fire pit. Weapons were forbidden except for knives. This would be a test of skill and strength, not who had the better rifle. Burning Sky stripped to the waist, revealing a torso covered in scars from previous battles. He was taller than Ayana, heavier, with the thick muscles of a man who had spent his life fighting. Ayana removed his shirt as well, and Serafina saw that his mixed heritage was written in his very flesh. His skin was lighter than full-blood Cheyenne, his features more angular, but his body bore the ritual scars of a warrior who had undergone the traditional trials. Whatever his parentage, he had earned his place among his adopted people through pain and courage. The two men circled each other in the makeshift arena, knives held low and ready. Burning Sky moved with the confidence of someone who had killed many enemies in single combat. Ayana was faster, more graceful, but he was also smaller and clearly operating on little sleep and considerable stress. They clashed suddenly, knives ringing against each other in a shower of sparks. Burning Sky pressed his advantage, using his superior reach and weight to drive Ayana backward toward the edge of the circle. The younger man barely avoided a slash that would have opened his throat, rolling away and coming up in a defensive crouch. "Your woman will scream beautifully when the fire takes her," Burning Sky taunted, launching another attack. "I will save her eyes for last, so she can watch her own flesh burn." The psychological warfare backfired. Instead of rattling Ayana, the threat seemed to focus him, burning away everything except the need to protect Serafina. His next attack was lightning fast, his knife finding the gap in Burning Sky's guard and drawing a thin line of blood across the chief's ribs. First blood to Ayana, but the rule was first blood, not first serious wound. Burning Sky's injury was superficial, barely more than a scratch. The chief grinned and redoubled his attack, forcing Ayana to give ground as the bigger man's blade whistled through the air where his head had been moments before. Serafina found herself praying to a god she hadn't spoken to since her mother's death, bargaining with whatever divine forces might be listening. She would give anything, her own life, her soul, whatever remained of her family's honor, if Ayana could just survive this fight. The two warriors were both bleeding now, multiple small cuts marking their torsos and arms as they traded strikes too fast for the eye to follow. Burning Sky's experience showed in his efficient movements, but Ayana's desperation gave him an edge that technique couldn't match. He wasn't just fighting for victory, he was fighting for the chance to save the only person who had shown him kindness since Sarah's death. The end came suddenly. Burning Sky overextended himself, going for a killing blow, confident that his superior size would carry the day. Ayana dropped low, slipping under the bigger man's guard, and drove his knife up and forward. The blade slid between ribs, finding the soft space beneath Burning Sky's arm, sinking deep into muscle and sinew. The chief roared in pain and fury, dropping his own weapon to clutch at the wound. Blood poured between his fingers, far more than the first blood the contest had called for. By the strict terms of their agreement, Ayana had won. But looking at the faces of the surrounding warriors, Serafina could see that victory in single combat might not be enough to save them. Several of the younger warriors had their hands on their weapons, clearly debating whether to honor their chief's bargain or simply kill the victorious challenger. Burning Sky himself was still on his feet, though he swayed slightly from blood loss. His painted face was a mask of rage and humiliation. "The spirits have spoken," Ayana announced, his voice carrying clearly across the circle. "I have proven my claim. The woman is mine by right of combat." For a moment that stretched like eternity, the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. Then Burning Sky straightened, pressing his hand tighter against his wound, and nodded slowly. "The half-breed speaks truth. Combat is won fairly." He looked directly at Serafina, his filed teeth glinting. "You are his woman now, White One. But remember, we are still Kiowa and you are still white. If we meet again—" He didn't finish the threat, but the implication was clear enough. This reprieve was temporary, bought with blood and courage, but subject to the changing winds of war and politics. If their paths crossed again under different circumstances, there would be no mercy. As the warriors began to disperse, tending to their wounded chief and gathering their weapons, Ayana swayed on his feet. The fight had taken more out of him than he'd let show, and several of his wounds were bleeding freely. Serafina rushed to his side, catching him as his knees buckled. "You fool," she whispered, pressing her hand against a particularly deep cut on his shoulder. "You beautiful, brave fool. You could have been killed." "Better than watching you burn," he replied weakly, managing a ghost of his earlier smile. "Besides, someone has to protect you until you can get back to civilization." The word, civilization, hung between them like a challenge. Back to Boston meant poverty, shame, and a lifetime of regret. But staying here meant constant danger, the possibility of discovery, and a life built on lies about a pregnancy that didn't exist and a marriage that had never taken place. "What happens now?" she asked, helping him walk toward the abandoned cabin where they had first hidden. "Now we disappear," Ayana said grimly, "before Burning Sky changes his mind, or before his warriors decide that honoring their chief's word isn't worth letting a white woman live." But as they reached the cabin, they found their escape route cut off. A line of mounted soldiers sat their horses at the edge of the settlement, their blue uniforms bright against the morning sky. At their head rode an officer whose insignia marked him as a colonel, his face grim as he surveyed the destruction of Copper Creek. One of the soldiers spotted them immediately, calling out to his commander. Within moments, they were surrounded by carbines and suspicious stares. "Survivors of the Apache raid?" the colonel asked, though his tone suggested he already doubted that simple explanation. "Kiowa, not Apache," Ayana corrected automatically, and then seemed to realize his mistake. A white woman traveling with an Indian, both bloody from recent violence. It would look suspicious under the best circumstances. The colonel's eyes narrowed as he took in Ayana's mixed features, his traditional clothing, the fresh wounds that spoke of recent combat. "Ma'am, are you all right? Has this man harmed you in any way?" It was the moment of truth. Serafina could claim to be a captive, could let the soldiers rescue her, and probably see Ayana hanged for the crimes they would assume he'd committed. It would be the safe choice, the expected choice, the one that would return her to the world she knew. Instead, she stepped closer to Ayana, taking his uninjured arm in a gesture that was unmistakably protective. "This man saved my life," she said clearly, meeting the colonel's stare with one of her own. "He is my husband." The lie came easier this time, but it carried a weight she hadn't expected. Looking into Ayana's surprised eyes, she realized it might not remain a lie for long. "Vultures," she said with disgust. "Maybe," Ayana agreed, "but vultures with horses and supplies. If we could make a deal—" "What kind of deal could we possibly offer? We have nothing they'd want." Ayana was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "They'd want you. A white woman, educated, refined. There are places south of the border where such things command high prices." The suggestion hit her like a physical blow. He was talking about selling her into slavery, trading her body for their survival. The casual way he mentioned it suggested he'd seen such transactions before, knew how they worked, what she might expect. "No," she said firmly. "Whatever else happens, no. It might be our only option. Then we'll die here." The certainty in her voice surprised them both. "I won't be sold like cattle, not even to save our lives." Ayana studied her face in the dim light, filtering through the cabin's broken walls. "You'd rather die than be used." "I'd rather die than be owned." The distinction mattered, though. She couldn't fully explain why. "There are worse things than death, Ayana. I learned that watching my mother fade away piece by piece, losing herself before she lost her life." He was quiet for a long time, processing her words. When he spoke, again, his voice held a new quality, something that might have been respect. "Then we find another way, such as, the traders won't stay long, too dangerous with war parties in the area. But they'll camp somewhere nearby tonight, probably at the old waterhole 2 miles south. If we could get close enough to their horses—" "You're talking about theft." "I'm talking about survival." His tone was matter-of-fact. "Those men make their living off other people's misery. They'd sell us both without a second thought if it suited their purposes." Serafina considered this. Everything she'd been taught about right and wrong seemed meaningless in the face of their current predicament. Proper ladies didn't steal horses or lie to soldiers or claim to be married to men they barely knew. But proper ladies also didn't survive in places like Copper Creek. How? She asked simply. Wait for full dark. Circle around to approach from the south. They'll expect trouble from the north where the war party went. Take 2 horses, leave the rest. Make it look like Indians did it. And then ride hard for the railroad. There's a construction camp, about 40 miles east near the river. If we can reach it, he shrugged. From there you can take the train back to civilization. What about you? I'll figure something out. I always do. The casual dismissal stung more than it should have. After everything they'd shared, all the dangers they'd faced together, he was still planning to abandon her at the first opportunity. But then she looked at his face and saw the truth beneath his careful words. He was trying to protect her from the complications his presence would bring. A half-breed husband would be a liability in the civilized world she came from. We'll decide about the future when we reach the railroad, she said finally. Right now, let's focus on staying alive long enough to have choices to make. As darkness fell over the ruins of Copper Creek, they prepared for what might be their last desperate gamble. The Mexican traders had indeed made camp at the water hole, their cookfire visible as a distant spark in the vast Colorado night. Between them and survival lay 2 miles of hostile territory, 5 armed men, and their own inexperience at this kind of desperate crime. But as Serafina checked the small derringer hidden in her dress, Her father's last gift carried a cross, half a continent to this moment of need. She felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Boston, the fierce satisfaction of taking control of her own destiny. Whatever happened tonight, she would face it as herself, not as someone else's property or burden. For the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, she felt truly alive. The first 20 yards passed in a blur of terror and adrenaline. Serafina's skirts caught on charred timber and scattered debris, threatening to trip her with every step. Behind them, the soldiers' covering fire created a wall of sound that drowned out everything except the whistle of bullets cutting through the air inches from their bodies. Halfway to the cabin, Ayana stumbled. His wounded shoulder had finally given out, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Serafina spun back without thinking, grabbing his good arm and hauling him upright with strength she didn't know she possessed. "Leave me," he gasped, blood seeping through the bandage she'd improvised from her petticoat. "You can still make it." "Not without you." The words came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, from a place that recognized him as essential to her survival. Not just physical survival, but something more fundamental, the preservation of whatever she was becoming in this harsh landscape. A Kiowa warrior broke from cover 30 yards away, his rifle swinging toward them. Time slowed as Serafina watched. His finger tightened on the trigger, knowing they were both about to die in the dust of this godforsaken settlement. Then Colonel Morrison's revolver barked twice, and the warrior spun away, clutching his chest. "Move!" Morrison roared from his position behind the overturned wagon. "I can't cover you much longer." They reached the cabin as the soldiers' ammunition began to run low. The covering fire sputtered and died, leaving only the crack of individual shots as Morrison's patrol fought their desperate rearguard action. Ayana kicked the cabin door open, and they tumbled inside just as bullets began chewing through the walls around them. The root cellar was exactly where Serafina remembered, a trapdoor hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the cold fireplace. Ayana pried it open with his knife while she gathered anything that might be useful: a broken axe handle, a rusted pot, a handful of moldy potatoes that might stave off starvation. "Down!" Ayana urged, lowering himself carefully into the earthen space beneath the cabin. The cellar was barely large enough for 2 people, forcing them to huddle together in the damp darkness as gunfire raged overhead. The battle above them continued for another 10 minutes that felt like hours. They could hear boots thundering across the cabin floor, voices shouting in both English and Kiowa as the fight ebbed and flowed through the ruins. At one point, someone kicked the trapdoor, and Serafina held her breath until her lungs burned, certain they'd been discovered. Then, gradually, the gunfire faded. Voices called out in Kiowa, followed by the sound of horses moving away from the settlement. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the battle had been. "Are they gone?" Serafina whispered, her voice barely audible in the cramped space. "Some of them." Ayana's breath was warm against her ear. "But they'll leave sentries. They know some of us escaped." They waited another hour before risking emergence. The cabin above them had been thoroughly searched. Furniture overturned and personal belongings scattered. Through the broken windows they could see bodies lying motionless in the afternoon sun, both soldiers and warriors paying the final price for their conflict. "Morrison?" Serafina asked, though she dreaded the answer. Ayana peered carefully through a gap in the boards. "Still alive, wounded but moving. Looks like 3 or 4 of his men made it too." He paused. "Burning Sky's body isn't among the dead. He got away." The implication was clear. This was far from over. The Kiowa chief would return with more warriors, determined to finish what he'd started. And next time, there would be no soldiers to provide, even temporary protection. "We need to leave," Serafina said, stating the obvious. "Tonight, before they can organize another attack." "Leave for where?" Ayana's question cut to the heart of their dilemma. Fort Collins is a week's ride through hostile territory. The nearest ranch is 3 days south, assuming it hasn't been burned already. And we have no horses, limited supplies, and... He gestured to his wounded shoulder. I'm not exactly in fighting condition. Serafina was quiet for a long moment, processing their impossible situation. Every option led to death or capture, yet staying meant certain discovery once Burning Sky returned. There had to be another choice, some path she hadn't considered. What about your people? She asked finally. The Cheyenne. Could we reach them? Ayana's laugh was bitter. You want to walk into a Cheyenne camp? A white woman traveling with a half-breed who's been living among whites for 5 years? They'd either kill us both or trade you to the Kiowa for horses. But you said you knew the old ways, the customs. I knew enough to bluff Burning Sky for one night. That doesn't make me welcome among people who've probably forgotten my name. His voice carried old pain, the weight of belonging nowhere completely. I left the reservation when Sarah died. Haven't been back since. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. The sound of approaching horses cut through their conversation. Through the cabin's broken windows, they could see riders moving slowly through the settlement. Not the war party returning, but something else. These riders wore different clothing, moved with different purpose. Traders, Ayana identified after careful observation. Mexican traders, by the look of them. Probably heard the gunfire and came to see what happened. Serafina watched the newcomers dismount near the center of the settlement. There were 5 of them, rough-looking men in wide-brimmed hats and travel-stained clothing. They moved through the battlefield with professional efficiency, checking bodies, gathering scattered weapons, and loading anything valuable onto their pack mules. The crawl to the traders' camp took 3 hours through scrub brush that tore at Serafina's already ruined dress and rocks that bit through her thin-soled boots. Every few minutes they stopped to listen for hoofbeats, for voices, for the whisper of moccasins on stone that might signal a Kiowa scout. But the Colorado night remained silent, except for the distant yip of coyotes and the rustle of wind through sage. Serafina's hands were raw and bleeding by the time they reached the ridge overlooking the waterhole. Her Boston corset, designed for drawing rooms and tea parties, felt like an iron cage around her ribs as she struggled to breathe quietly. Sweat had long since soaked through her chemise, and her hair hung in damp tangles where it had escaped her pins. Below them, the Mexican traders sat around their cook fire, sharing a bottle and speaking in rapid Spanish. Their horses stood hobbled, nearby, dark shapes against the starlit grass. 5 animals, just as Ayana had counted. 2 pack mules carried their plunder from Copper Creek, including what looked like Colonel Morrison's cavalry sword gleaming in the firelight. "Changed my mind," Ayana whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "We take 3 horses, not 2. Why?" But even as she asked, Serafina understood. 2 horses meant they traveled together. 3 meant options, escape routes, the possibility of splitting up if pursuit caught them. "Insurance," he said simply. They waited until the traders finished their bottle and settled into sleep. One man remained on watch, walking slow circuits around the camp with a rifle cradled in his arms. His pattern was predictable: 30 steps toward the horses, 30 back toward the fire, pause to warm his hands, repeat. "When he reaches the fire next time," Ayana murmured, "move fast, stay low, and whatever happens, don't look back." The sentry reached the fire, stretched, and bent to add wood to the flames. Ayana moved like smoke down the hillside, and Serafina followed, her heart hammering against her stays. The hobbled horses stirred nervously as they approached, catching their scent. Ayana's hands flew over the leather restraints, his movements sure despite the darkness. He'd done this before, Serafina realized, probably more than once. The thought should have disturbed her, but instead she felt oddly reassured. Whatever else he might be, Ayana was a survivor. The first horse came free just as the sentry began his return circuit. Ayana pressed the reins into Serafina's hands and moved to the second animal. His wounded shoulder made the work slower, more awkward. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he struggled with the knots. 20 steps, 15, 10. The third horse snorted and shied as Ayana finally freed its legs. The sound carried clearly in the still air, and the sentry stopped mid-stride, his head turning toward the darkness where they crouched. "¿Quién está ahí?" the man called softly. Ayana froze, one hand still tangled in the horse's hobble. The sentry took a step toward them, then another, his rifle rising. In the firelight, Serafina could see his finger sliding toward the trigger. She acted without thinking. Her derringer appeared in her hand as if by magic, and she put a bullet through the man's thigh. He went down screaming, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the air as he fell. The camp exploded into chaos. Men rolled from their blankets, shouting questions in Spanish and English. Someone kicked the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. A pistol cracked, its bullet whining off the rocks where they'd been standing moments before, but they were no longer standing there. The gunshot had spooked the horses, and Serafina found herself clinging to her mount's neck as it bolted into the night. Behind her, she could hear Ayana cursing in what sounded like 3 different languages as he tried to control his own panicking animal. The traders' shouts faded behind them as they rode hard across the broken landscape. Serafina had never been much of a horsewoman. Her Boston upbringing had included only sedate rides in Central Park on gentle mares. This wild gallop through darkness on a half-wild Mustang was like trying to ride a thunderstorm. Somehow, she stayed in the saddle. Her hands bled where the reins cut into her palms, and her thighs screamed from the unaccustomed strain. But she held on. Behind them, torches flickered as the traders organized pursuit, but they had precious minutes of darkness on their side. They rode east, following the star pattern Ayana had shown her earlier. The Big Dipper hung low on the horizon, its handle pointing toward the railroad camps and civilization. 40 miles had seemed an impossible distance when they were on foot. Now, with stolen horses beneath them, it felt almost manageable. "You shot him?" Ayana called over the thunder of hoofbeats. "I shot near him," Serafina corrected, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Everything had happened so fast, and her father's derringer wasn't known for accuracy. Since when do Boston ladies carry guns? Since their fathers lose everything. To con men and card sharps. The words came out bitter, carrying years of carefully suppressed anger. Papa taught me to shoot the same week he taught me that the world isn't safe for women, with no money and no protection. They rode in silence after that, saving their breath for the journey ahead. The stolen horses were tough range animals, bred for endurance rather than speed. They could maintain this pace for hours if necessary, carrying their riders far from the danger behind them. But as dawn approached, other problems became apparent. They had no food except the moldy potatoes from the cabin, no water except what they could find in streams and puddles, and Ayana's shoulder was bleeding again, leaving dark stains on his shirt that spoke of internal damage his stoic demeanor couldn't hide. "We need to rest," Serafina said, as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. "Not yet. They'll expect us to stop at dawn, try to follow our trail while they can still see it." Ayana swayed slightly in his saddle, catching himself before he could fall. "Few more hours, then we find shelter." "You're bleeding again." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're pale as a ghost and swaying like a drunkard." Serafina's voice carried the authority she'd developed during her mother's long illness, the tone that brooked no argument from stubborn patience. "We stop at the next water, or I'll shoot you myself and put you out of your misery." Despite everything, Ayana almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." They found water 2 hours later, a small creek fed by mountain snowmelt, running clear and cold between stands of cottonwood. The horses drank gratefully, while Serafina examined Ayana's shoulder in the growing daylight. The wound was worse than he'd admitted. The knife had gone deep, slicing through muscle and possibly nicking bone. The makeshift bandage had worked loose during their ride, and infection was already setting in around the edges. Without proper medical attention, he could lose the arm. Or worse. "This needs cleaning," she said, tearing strips from her petticoat. We don't have time for you to die of blood poisoning either." She began washing the wound with creek water, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. "Hold still." The intimacy of tending his injury brought unexpected awareness. Her hands on his bare skin, the flecks of muscle beneath her fingers, the warm scent of his body mixed with blood and leather. She found herself studying the scars that marked his torso, some from knives, others from bullets, all of them stories. She didn't know how to read. "How many times have you been shot?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, enough to know the difference between fatal and inconvenient. His voice was steady despite the pain she was causing. "This one's inconvenient, for now." She tied off the new bandage with perhaps more force than necessary. "But if we don't reach help soon, we will." The certainty in his voice made her look up, meeting his dark eyes. "I didn't fight Burning Sky and steal horses just to die of a scratch by a creek." "This is not a scratch." "No," he agreed. "But it's not fatal either. Not yet." They shared one of the moldy potatoes while the horses rested, each taking small bites, and trying not to think about the meals they'd left behind in their former lives. Serafina found herself remembering the elaborate Sunday dinners her family had once enjoyed: roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, fresh bread with real butter, apple pie that made the whole house smell like heaven. "What are you thinking about?" Ayana asked, noting her expression. "Food." She managed a weak smile. "Ridiculous, isn't it? 2 days ago I was complaining about the stagecoach meals. Now I'd kill for a piece of hardtack. Food's important when you don't have it." He leaned back against a cottonwood trunk, his face grey with fatigue. "I once went 4 days without eating during a blizzard. When I finally found food, I cried. Like a baby." "Where was this?" "Wyoming territory. I was hunting Bounty, white man who'd killed a family of settlers and tried to blame it on Indians." His expression darkened. "Found him too, but not before the storm hit." Serafina tried to imagine him as a bounty hunter, tracking killers across the frontier. It fit with his skills, his knowledge of weapons and tracking, his easy familiarity with violence, but it also raised questions about the kind of man she'd trusted with her life. "Did you kill him? The man you were hunting?" "No." Ayana's answer surprised her. "Brought him back alive, stood trial, hanged legal-like. Some men deserve killing, but most deserve justice. There's a difference. Most men. Some are animals. Burning Sky, for instance. He doesn't kill for war or honor or even revenge anymore. He kills because he likes it, because it makes him feel powerful." Ayana's voice carried old disgust. "Men like that, justice is a luxury we can't afford." The casual acceptance of necessary killing should have frightened her. Instead, Serafina found it oddly comforting. In this harsh land, where survival often meant violence, she was traveling with someone who understood the difference between killing and murder, between necessary force and cruelty. "We should move," Ayana said, struggling to his feet. "Sun's getting high, and those traders won't give up easy." They remounted and continued east, following the creek when possible to hide their tracks. The landscape gradually changed from high desert to rolling grassland, marked by scattered homesteads and the occasional cattle ranch. Signs of civilization, but also signs of the war raging across the territory. Burned buildings, abandoned farms, graves marked with crude wooden crosses. "It's getting worse," Serafina observed, noting the increasing frequency of destruction. "Always does, before it gets better." Ayana guided his horse around the charred remains of what had once been a substantial ranch house. Few more years, the army will have the tribes on reservations, and settlers will fill up all this empty land. Progress, they call it. You don't sound convinced it's progress. Progress for who? His question hung in the air between them as they rode past another grave, this one marked only with a pile of stones. The Cheyenne lived here for generations before white men came. They had their own kind of progress, following the buffalo, respecting the land, taking only what they needed. But surely civilization brings benefits. Medicine, education, law. Whose law? Ayana's voice carried bitter experience. I've seen civilized law at work. It says a white woman can't marry an Indian, but it's perfectly legal for white men to rape Indian women. It says stealing horses is a hanging offense, but stealing an entire continent is manifest destiny. The words stung because they carried uncomfortable truth. Serafina had grown up believing in the righteousness of westward expansion, the noble mission of bringing civilization to the wilderness. But sitting here among the graves and ruins, she began to understand that every story had more than one side. "What do you believe in?" she asked quietly. Ayana rode in silence for several minutes before answering. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than bitter. "I believe in people who keep their word. I believe in protecting those who can't protect themselves. I believe," he paused, as if weighing his words carefully. "I believe that love matters more than law, and kindness matters more than color." Something in his tone made her look at him sharply. "Is that why you helped me? Because you believe in protecting people?" "Partly." His dark eyes met hers briefly before looking away. "And partly because you remind me of Sarah. Not in looks, but in something. The way you refuse to give up, maybe. The way you adapt to circumstances that would break most people. The comparison to his dead wife should have felt like a compliment. Instead, it left Serafina with an odd sense of unease, as if she were competing with a ghost for a place in his affections. But before she could examine the feeling more closely, Ayana suddenly reined in his horse. "Smoke," he said, pointing to a thin column rising in the distance. "Too much for a campfire, not enough for a house burning. Could be the railroad camp." They urged their tired horses toward the smoke, hope and anxiety warring in Serafina's chest. The railroad meant safety, civilization, the chance to escape the violence that had consumed the last 3 days of her life. But it also meant decisions, about where to go next, about whether Ayana would disappear from her life as suddenly as he'd entered it. As they crested a low hill, the source of the smoke became visible. Below them lay a sprawling construction camp, with dozens of tents and temporary buildings scattered along the grade where workers were laying track. Men moved about their business, some driving supply wagons, others wielding hammers and shovels in the eternal labor of pushing the railroad west. It looked like sanctuary. It looked like salvation. It also looked like a trap, because riding toward the camp from the north came a line of horsemen that Serafina recognized with growing horror. Mexican traders, their faces grim with purpose, following the trail that would lead them straight to their stolen horses and the people who had taken them. He came at her like a charging bull, confident that his size and reach would end the combat in seconds, but Serafina wasn't where he expected her to be. 3 days of running, fighting, and surviving had taught her lessons no Boston finishing school could provide. She moved like smoke, letting his momentum carry him past her while she stepped aside. Her derringer barked once, the bullet taking Pete in the thigh and dropping him to one knee. He roared in pain and rage, swinging his knife in a wide arc that would have disemboweled her if she'd been standing still. But she was already moving, circling to stay out of range of his longer weapon. "Stand still and fight," Pete bellowed, struggling to rise on his wounded leg. "Why?" Serafina's voice was steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her. You're bigger, stronger, and better armed. Standing still would just be stupid. The logic infuriated him. Pete lunged again, his knife seeking her heart, but the wounded leg betrayed him. He stumbled off balance, and Serafina's second shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending the Bowie knife flying from nerveless fingers. The giant crashed to the ground, his massive frame shaking the earth. For a moment, Serafina thought the fight was over. Then Pete's good hand closed around a fist-sized rock, and he hurled it with the last of his strength. The stone caught her in the forehead, dropping her to her knees as blood streamed down her face. Her vision blurred, and the derringer slipped from fingers gone suddenly numb. Around the circle, men held their breath, waiting to see who would rise first. Scar-Eye Pete struggled to his feet, blood pouring from his wounds, but determination written on his ruined face. He retrieved his knife and advanced on Serafina, raising the blade for a killing stroke. Should have stayed in Boston, little girl, he wheezed. That's when Ayana's voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. Sarah, the axe handle! Through her dazed vision, Serafina saw the broken tool lying near the edge of the circle, dropped by some worker and forgotten until this moment. Her hand closed around it just as Pete's knife descended, using the wood to block the blade before, driving the splintered end up into his throat. Pete's eyes went wide with shock and pain. He tried to speak, but only blood came out. He swayed for a moment, then crashed backward like a felled tree, his knife clattering away across the hard-packed earth. Silence fell over the combat circle like a shroud. Then, gradually, the reality sank in. The impossible had happened. The Boston lady had killed the frontier champion in single combat, armed with nothing but a two-shot derringer and her father's final gift of courage. "Combat is finished," Murphy announced, his voice carrying clearly to both camps. "The woman wins by right of arms." The renegade leader stared at his fallen champion for a long moment, then turned his horse away without another word. Burning Sky lingered a moment longer, his painted face unreadable, before following his white allies into the growing distance. They had kept their word, honor among thieves perhaps, or simple recognition that trying to take the railroad camp by force would cost more than any revenge was worth. Either way, the threat was over. Dr. Henley rushed to tend Serafina's head wound, while Ayana struggled from his cot to reach her side. The cut was superficial but bloody, the kind of injury that looked worse than it was. "That was the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever seen," Ayana said, taking her hand in his. "Probably," she agreed, wincing as the doctor cleaned her forehead. "But it worked. This time. What about next time?" Serafina looked at him seriously, seeing past the pain medication to the man beneath. "Next time, we face it together. If you'll have me. If I'll—" Ayana shook his head in amazement. "Woman, after what you just did, I'd follow you into hell itself." "I'm not asking you to follow me anywhere," she replied quietly. "I'm asking you to walk beside me, partners, equals, whatever comes." 2 months later, they were married by a circuit preacher in the growing town of Cedar Springs, 50 miles east of where Copper Creek had once stood. Serafina wore a simple blue dress she'd bought with money earned helping Dr. Henley tend railroad workers. Ayana stood straight and proud in new clothes, his shoulder finally healed enough for normal movement. The ceremony was witnessed by Murphy and his crew, along with a handful of settlers who'd become friends over the weeks of recovery and rebuilding. It wasn't the grand Boston wedding Serafina had once imagined, but it was real, in a way those childhood dreams had never been. They built their life slowly, carefully, in a land that demanded both courage and patience. Ayana used his tracking skills to work as a scout for the army, helping keep the peace between settlers and the remaining free tribes. Serafina opened a small school, teaching children whose parents came from a dozen different backgrounds and traditions. It wasn't easy. There were those who disapproved of their mixed marriage, who made their prejudices known in small cruelties and large obstacles. But there were also those who judged them by their actions rather than their ancestry, who saw the quiet strength they brought to their community. Years later, when their own children asked about how they'd met, Serafina would tell them about the stagecoach that brought her west to marry a stranger, about the raid that destroyed her carefully laid plans, about the warrior who taught her that love was stronger than law and courage more valuable than conformity. She would tell them about the night they hid in a root cellar while death stalked the ruins above, about the dawn when she chose to fight rather than flee, about the moment she realized that sometimes the wrong train takes you to exactly the right destination. But mostly, she would tell them about choice, how every day brought decisions that shaped who you became, how love was a choice you made again and again, how courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The frontier had changed her, stripped away everything she thought she needed, and left her with everything. She actually wanted a man who saw her as an equal, a life built on mutual respect rather than social obligation, children who would grow up believing that love mattered more than prejudice. It wasn't the life she'd planned when she stepped off that stagecoach in Copper Creek. It was better. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The approaching riders materialized out of the darkness like ghosts given form. Serafina counted at least 20 mounted figures silhouetted against the star-filled sky, moving with the disciplined spacing of military formation. But something about their posture, their weapons, set her teeth on edge. "That's not cavalry," Ayana said grimly, struggling to sit up despite the laudanum clouding his senses. His good hand fumbled for the revolver Dr. Henley had set aside with his other belongings. Murphy squinted into the darkness, his weathered face creasing with concern. "You're right. No Gaiden, no bugler, and they're carrying too many rifles for a standard patrol." He turned to bark orders at his men. "Douse that fire. Get the cannon loaded with canister shot. All hands to defensive positions." The railroad camp transformed with startling efficiency. Workers who'd been sharing stories and coffee around the cookfire moments before grabbed rifles and took cover behind supply wagons and construction equipment. The easy camaraderie of the evening evaporated, replaced by the grim tension of men preparing for battle. As the riders drew closer, torchlight revealed details that made Serafina's blood run cold. Mixed among what looked like white men in civilian clothes were painted warriors, Kiowa from their distinctive war paint and weapons. Somehow, impossibly, Burning Sky had found allies among the very people who should have been his enemies. Renegades. Murphy spat, recognizing the mixed composition of the approaching force. White men gone bad, teamed up with hostiles, worst kind of vermin on the frontier. A voice called out from the darkness, speaking English with the educated accent of someone who'd once been a gentleman. "Hello, the camp! We come under a flag of truce!" "I see your flag," Murphy shouted back, though Serafina could see no such thing. "State your business. We're looking for stolen horses and the thieves who took them. Turn over the man and woman you're harboring, and we'll leave peacefully." Murphy's eyes flicked to Serafina and Ayana. In the brief moment of silence that followed, she could see him weighing options, calculating odds. 20 armed men against 50 workers sounded like good odds, until you factored in that the attackers were experienced fighters, while most of his crew were laborers with minimal combat training. "Don't know what you're talking about," Murphy called back. "We got no horse thieves here, just honest railroad workers." "The woman shot one of my men," the voice continued, closer now. In the flickering torchlight, Serafina could make out the speaker, a tall man in an expensive coat gone to rags, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Mexican traders don't forget that kind of insult, neither do their Kiowa friends. The threat was clear enough. This wasn't just about stolen horses anymore. It was about pride, revenge, and the kind of frontier justice that usually ended with someone decorating a tree. "Mister," Murphy's voice carried the steel of a man who'd faced Confederate artillery at Antietam. "I don't give a damn what you think these folks did or didn't do. They're under my protection now. And that's the end of it." A new voice joined the conversation, Burning Sky himself, speaking in heavily accented English. "White Chief speaks brave words, but winter comes, and dead men feel no cold." The philosophical threat sent chills down Serafina's spine. She'd heard that tone before, in the cabin at Copper Creek. Burning Sky wasn't just threatening violence, he was promising it. Savoring the anticipation of inflicting pain and death on those who defied him. "What do you want?" she asked quietly, though her voice carried clearly in the tense silence. "Serafina, no," Ayana warned, but she was already moving toward the edge of the camp, close enough to be seen in the torchlight. "I want justice," the renegade leader replied. "My partner lies fevered from the bullet you put in his leg. Could be he dies, could be he don't. Either way, someone pays the price." "Name your terms," Serafina said, ignoring Murphy's sharp intake of breath. "Simple enough. You and the breed come with us, face judgment for your crimes. Rest of these folks go about their business unmolested." It was the same impossible choice she'd faced before: sacrifice herself to save others, or watch innocent people die for her mistakes. But this time felt different. This time she had something to lose beyond her own life. "Counteroffer," Ayana called out, his voice stronger than it had been since the fight with Burning Sky. "Single combat. Your champion against mine. Winner takes all," the renegade leader laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You're in no condition to fight a child, much less a warrior. Besides, we tried that game already. Didn't work out so well." "For the chief here, not me," Ayana said quietly. "Her." The words fell into silence like stones into still water. Every eye in the camp turned to Serafina, measuring her slight frame against the professional killers ranged beyond the firelight. The idea was absurd, a Boston-bred woman facing a frontier fighter in single combat. It was also their only chance. "I accept," Serafina said before anyone could object. "Ma'am, with respect, that's suicide," Murphy protested. "These men will send their best against you. You wouldn't last 30 seconds. "Probably not," she agreed, "but it buys time for you to get word to the army, maybe get reinforcements before they can regroup and attack again. It also gets you killed," Ayana pointed out harshly. "I won't watch another woman die because I couldn't protect her." Serafina knelt beside his cot, meeting his eyes in the lamplight. "You protected me as much as any man could. You gave me 3 days of being truly alive, truly myself. That's worth more than a lifetime of safety in a world that was slowly killing me anyway." Before he could argue further, she kissed him, softly, briefly, but with all the emotion she couldn't find words to express. When she pulled back, his eyes were wide with surprise and something that might have been love. "Don't you dare die on me," he whispered. "I'll do my best not to," she replied, forcing a smile. "But if I do, remember that I chose this. Remember that it mattered." The combat was scheduled for dawn, giving both sides time to prepare and witnesses time to gather. Word spread quickly through the camp, and by first light, every railroad worker was armed and positioned to ensure fair play. No one expected Serafina to win, but they were determined that her opponent wouldn't cheat his way to victory. The renegade champion turned out to be a giant of a man called Scar Eye Pete, so named for the knife wound that had taken his left eye and left his face a map of old violence. He stood nearly 7 feet tall and moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd killed dozens of opponents in single combat. Serafina, by contrast, looked like a child's doll, dressed for a tea party. Dr. Henley had found her a pair of men's, trousers and a work shirt, but even the smallest sizes hung loose on her slight frame. Her weapon was her father's derringer, hardly a match for the massive Bowie knife Pete carried. "Last chance to reconsider?" Murphy offered quietly as she prepared for the fight. "Ain't no shame in admitting this is a fool's errand." "There's shame in watching good people die when you could prevent it," Serafina replied, checking the derringer's load for the dozenth time. "Besides, I might surprise him." "How?" She smiled, and for a moment Murphy saw something that reminded him uncomfortably of his old sergeant, a man who'd been too crazy to know when he was beaten. "He's expecting a helpless woman. I'm not entirely helpless anymore." The combat circle was drawn in the dirt between the two camps, witnessed by men whose word would be trusted even among frontier renegades. Rules were simple: fight until one combatant yielded or died. No interference from either side, no quarter. Asked or given, Scar-Eye Pete entered the circle like a force of nature, his massive frame throwing long shadows in the morning light. He twirled his Bowie knife with practiced ease, the blade humming through the air in complex patterns designed to intimidate as much as warm up. Serafina walked to the center of the circle with steady steps, her derringer held low and ready. She looked impossibly small beside her opponent, but there was something in her bearing that made seasoned fighters among the spectators lean forward with interest. "You sure about this, little girl?" Pete's voice was a gravelly rumble. "Still time to save yourself some pain." "I'm sure," Serafina replied quietly. "The question is whether you're ready to die for stolen horses and wounded pride." Pete's laugh was cut short as the fight began. "They'll be back," Ayana warned quietly as willing hands helped him toward the camp medical tent. "Let 'em come," the foreman replied grimly. "We got enough firepower here to hold off a cavalry regiment and men who know how to use it. These boys fought in the war. They ain't afraid of a few Mexican bandits." The railroad camp's medical facilities consisted of one overworked doctor and a tent full of supplies designed more for construction accidents than gunshot wounds. But Dr. Henley had served as a field surgeon during the war, and he'd seen worse. "Injuries than Ayana's knife wound. Missed the bone," he announced after a thorough examination. "Cut some muscle, but nothing that won't heal with proper care and rest. Main concern is infection, but we caught it early enough." "How long?" Serafina asked, surprising herself with how much the answer mattered. "Week or two of limited activity. Month before he's back to full strength." The doctor began cleaning and suturing the wound with practiced efficiency, assuming no complications and plenty of rest. The word seemed foreign after 3 days of constant motion and mortal danger. Serafina found herself swaying on her feet as exhaustion finally caught up with her. When had she last slept? Really slept, not just dozed fitfully between crises. "Ma'am, you look about ready to fall over," the foreman observed kindly. "We got a spare tent you can use, and the cook's got stew on the fire. Real food, not trail rations." The offer of food made her stomach clench with hunger, so sharp it was almost painful. "That's very kind, but we can't pay." "Who said anything about payment? We take care of our own out here, and anyone running from raiders is our own, Faraz. I'm concerned." The foreman's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "Name's Murphy, by the way. Patrick Murphy, section foreman for this stretch of track." "Sarah," Serafina replied, borrowing the name of Ayana's dead wife without thinking. "Sarah Hawkins." The surname felt strange on her tongue, but it established her as Ayana's wife without raising questions about mixed marriages. Murphy nodded approvingly. "Well, Mrs. Hawkins, you and your husband are welcome to stay as long as you need. We got a telegraph line if you want to send word to family. Let 'em know you're safe." Family. The word highlighted just how alone she really was. Her parents were dead. Her few remaining relatives in Boston had made it clear she wasn't welcome after the scandal of her father's bankruptcy. There was no one to wire, no one who would worry if she never arrived at her destination. Except Thomas. Brennan was dead too, killed in the raid that had destroyed her carefully planned future. The marriage that was supposed to save her from destitution had died before it could begin, leaving her with what? No money, no prospects, no family to return to. "Are you all right, Mum?" Murphy's voice carried genuine concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired," she managed, though the truth was more complex. For the first time since stepping off the stagecoach in Copper Creek, she had a moment to think beyond immediate survival. And what she saw when she looked ahead was a void as empty as the prairie around them. That evening, fed and clean for the first time in days, Serafina sat beside Ayana's cot in the medical tent. He was sleeping fitfully, his face pale but peaceful. Dr. Henley had dosed him with laudanum for the pain, promising a full recovery if he followed orders and rested. "Penny for your thoughts," Ayana murmured without opening his eyes. "I thought you were asleep, drifting in and out. Hard to sleep deeply when you're not sure what you'll wake up to." He turned his head to look at her, his dark eyes still clouded. "With medication but alert, you've been thinking, I can tell by the way you're sitting." Serafina was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "What happens now, when you're healed, when we leave here? What then? You take the train back east, resume your life. What life?" The question came out more bitter than she'd intended. "I have no money, no home, no family that wants to acknowledge my existence. The whole reason I came west was because I had nothing left in Boston." Ayana struggled to sit up despite her protests. "There are opportunities for women in the cities. Teaching maybe, or charity work?" She shook her head. "I've seen what happens to unmarried women of my age and situation. We become spinster relatives, dependent on the kindness of others, grateful for any scraps of dignity we're allowed to keep. It's better than this." He gestured at the tent around them, at the harsh frontier beyond its canvas walls. "Better than running from raiders and sleeping on the ground and never knowing if tomorrow will bring death or worse." "Is it?" Serafina met his eyes directly. "Because for all the danger, for all the hardship, I felt more alive in the last 3 days than I had in the 3 years before them. I made choices that mattered. I fought for something worth fighting. You fought for survival. That's not the same as living, isn't it?" She leaned forward, searching his face for understanding. "In Boston I was dying by inches, respectably, quietly, but still dying. Here, even with all the danger, I found out who I really am underneath all the rules and expectations." Ayana was quiet for a long time, processing her words. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe I don't want to go back. Maybe I want to stay here, build something new instead of trying to resurrect something that was never really alive in the first place."
"Stay where? This is a railroad camp, not a town. In 6 months they'll move on to the next section of track. Then I'll move with them, or find somewhere else." She paused, gathering courage for what she wanted to say next. "Maybe somewhere."
"With a man who understands what it means to start over, to build a life from nothing." The invitation hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Ayana studied her face in the lamplight, searching for doubt or uncertainty or signs that the laudanum was making her say things she didn't mean. "You don't know what you're asking," he said finally. "A life with me means always being on the outside, never quite belonging anywhere. It means children who'll face the same prejudice I've faced. It means being with someone who sees me as I really am, not as what society expects me to be." Serafina reached for his uninjured hand, finding it warm and solid beneath her fingers. "I'd rather be an outcast with you than a proper lady with anyone else." Before he could respond, the tent flap opened and Murphy stepped inside, his face grim in the lamplight. "Sorry to disturb you folks, but we've got a problem. Riders approaching from the south. Lot of them moving fast. Could be military, could be more trouble." He paused, studying their faces. "Either way, thought you should know they'll be here within the hour." "How long?" Serafina asked, watching the distant riders approach the railroad camp. 10 minutes, maybe less." Ayana's voice was tight with pain and exhaustion. "They're pushing their horses hard." The irony was bitter. Safety lay less than a mile away, hundreds of workers, foremen with authority, possibly even a telegraph connection to summon help. But between them and Sanctuary rode 5 angry men who wanted their stolen horses back, along with whatever justice they felt appropriate for horse thieves and the woman who'd shot one of their own. "We could circle around," Serafina suggested. Though even as she spoke, she could see the futility of it. Their horses were spent, Ayana was barely staying conscious, and the open grassland offered no cover for a wide detour. On these horses, we'd never make it. Ayana studied the approaching riders with professional assessment. They've got fresh mounts, and they know this country better than we do. Then what? We go straight in, fast and loud, before they can cut us off. His hand moved to check his revolver, a gesture that had become automatic. Once we're in the camp, surrounded by witnesses, they won't dare try anything. You hope? I pray. The admission surprised them both. Ayana didn't seem like a man who put much faith in divine intervention. They spurred their flagging horses down the hillside, abandoning stealth for speed. Behind them, shouts erupted as the traders spotted their quarry making a desperate run for the railroad camp. The chase was on. Serafina's stolen mount stumbled twice on the rough ground, each time nearly sending her tumbling from the saddle. She could hear the traders gaining ground, their fresher horses eating up the distance with frightening speed. A gunshot cracked behind them, the bullet going wide but close enough to make her horse shy sideways. The railroad camp grew larger with terrifying slowness. She could see individual workers now, could make out the steam from a locomotive working somewhere beyond the tents. So close, yet still impossibly far, with armed men thundering down on them. Another shot, this one closer. A third, and Ayana's horse screamed and went down, throwing its rider hard into the rocky ground. Serafina wheeled her mount around without thinking, riding back toward where Ayana lay motionless. "Leave me!" he shouted, struggling to rise, despite what looked like a broken arm. "Keep going!" But she was already dismounting, hauling him upright with strength born of desperation. The traders were close enough now that she could see their faces, could read the ugly intent written there. These weren't men who planned to turn them over to railroad authorities for a fair trial. Ayana's legs gave out as she tried to help him walk. Too much blood loss, too much pain, too much damage, that his stubborn will could no longer overcome. They weren't going to make it to the camp. The traders would catch them here in the open, and whatever happened next wouldn't be quick or merciful. That's when the locomotive whistle screamed across the prairie. The sound was so loud, so unexpected, that both pursuers and pursued stopped in their tracks. From the railroad camp came an answering whistle, then another. Within moments, the entire construction site was alive with activity as workers poured out of tents and buildings to see what was happening. "Indian raid!" someone shouted from the camp. "Indians attacking civilians!" The misidentification was understandable from a distance. To the railroad workers, all they could see was a group of armed horsemen chasing 2 people across the prairie. In territory where Indian attacks were a constant threat, they jumped to the obvious conclusion. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Rifles appeared as if by magic in the hands of work crews. A small cannon, probably kept for exactly this sort of emergency, was wheeled into position. Within minutes, the approaching traders found themselves facing not 2 helpless fugitives, but an armed camp full of men spoiling for a fight. The traders reined in their horses, suddenly uncertain. 5 men, no matter how motivated, couldn't assault a fortified position held by 50 or more defenders. They milled about in confusion, close enough to see their quarry, but unable to reach them without committing suicide. "Help!" Serafina called. toward the camp, putting every ounce of desperation she possessed into her voice. "Please help us. They killed my husband's family." The lie came easily now, shaped by 3 days of deception and survival. But it was also a lie with enough truth to sell. Ayana did look like he might be dying, and the traders did look like the kind of men who might murder a family and steal their horses. A group of workers started toward them, led by a big man in work clothes, who carried a rifle with the easy competence of someone who knew how to use it. The traders saw them coming and began backing their horses away, unwilling to face superior numbers and firepower. "You all right, Mum?" the foreman called as he approached. His eyes took in Serafina's torn dress, her bleeding hands, Ayana's obvious wounds. "These men been bothering you?" They attacked our homestead," Serafina gasped, allowing exhaustion and relief to color her voice. "Killed everyone except my husband and me. We've been running for 2 days." The foreman's face darkened as he looked at the traders, now retreating but still within rifle range. "That's so. Well, we don't take kindly to murdering thieves in these parts." He raised his voice, calling to his men. "Boys, I think these gentlemen need an escort out of our territory." What followed was less a battle than a rout. Faced with organized resistance and superior numbers, the traders chose discretion over valor. They wheeled their horses and rode hard for the horizon, abandoning their pursuit rather than face a squad of angry railroad workers armed with military surplus rifles.